Thank you all for being here on this beautiful, gorgeous day outside when you could be sitting by the river with a beer. So I really appreciate that you're here, and it's actually really awesome to see a lot of people I know and who've been part of my journey of coming to Berlin. I came here about 2 years ago, and prior to that I had lived nowhere for 5 years. So home was not quite a physical place anymore, but it was really people. So seeing some people here that I've known from different parts of my life is quite special. So I'm also excited because it's my first opportunity to kind of publicly talk about some of the things that I do with people usually behind the corporate paywall. And so I get to give a little bit of a brain dump and share some things that I've learned over the years of working with different change makers. And last time I was actually here, we had a gentleman from Ashoka who was talking about how they found with their work with entrepreneurs that the human side was actually what was getting really important. Like all the tools, design thinking, lean, agile, great tools, they're out there to make innovation happen. But what people were missing was resilience, right? That personal capacity to deal with setbacks, to deal with problems, and to do it anyway and keep going. So the other title for this talk, let's see if we can do this. No? Let's see. It did work earlier when we tried it. Okay. It's dying. This is one of those beautiful moments talking about being resilient, you know, when you're trying to do a presentation and your whole technology craps out on you. But, okay. There we go. So the other title for this talk is How to Not Kill Yourself While You're Creating Culture. And I mean that in the sense that I've myself had months of my life when I've actually considered that. But just to give you a little bit of overview, I'm going to go give you sort of a brain dump of a human operating system and some of the maps I found as I've been dealing with this myself. Right? So what is this full self, and how can we create passion, how can we create connection with people, and ultimately create results. Right? And the times when I've wanted to kill myself were mostly times when I've struggled with purpose. Right? When I didn't feel in the flow. I was just talking to my friend the other day about how sometimes you feel good, sometimes you feel bad, that's fine, you can deal with that. But when you don't feel like you're connected, when you don't feel like you're actually doing your thing, and when everything seems against you, that's when you kind of want to just crumble and not be here. Right? And purpose is one of those words that gets a lot of purpose washing bullshit, like we're all doing purpose now, kind of thing out there too. For me, it's simply the why. Right? Like why do I do what I do? Why am I here today? Why am I getting up? Why am I doing anything? Right? And not being clear on your why really doesn't make sense to me that you would do anything if you don't know why you're doing it. Right? When you ask people why they, who they are, they might tell you what they do, maybe they can tell you a little bit about how they do it, and very few people can tell you why they do it. Right? So for me, that's kind of a starting point. And in my work with teams, what I found is that our purpose, sort of this big life purpose thing, is often connected to sort of our first injustice. Right? When you think back to when you were 6 or 7, you kind of, for the first time, realize that this world is they're kind of lying to you here. There's some bullshit going on. There's things that are not quite right. Right? When you have that first experience of righteous anger, not the erotic personal anger, but that whole like, this isn't okay in the world. Right? And I can trace mine back to when I was about 7 or 8. I started writing poetry because my big cousin was writing poetry, so I tried to be all cool too and write poetry. And one of the first poems I wrote was about this idea of a world without hatred, without war, without all that crap that I was seeing out there. And I wanted to have a meaningful life. Right? And be like, what's a meaningful life? And the word meaning actually comes from the German word meinen, which means to make mine. Right? When you just do what other people tell you, preacher, teacher, mother, father, instructors, right? You're actually not living a meaningful life. Right? You live a meaningful life when you make it yours. So I knew early on that I wanted to have a meaningful life, I wanted to have some impact on this world thing, and that's kind of these two make up purpose, right? Personal vision, who am I, what am I doing here, and having an actual effect out in the world. And so I looked at the world and I said, okay, how does this thing work, right? And there seems to be this sort of cultural operating system, right? And we can talk about culture for hours and kind of geeking out on that stuff. But culture, in a simple definition, how we do things around here, right? And if I look at this planet, we have this sort of operating system, and if you're inside this operating system, everything is easy, right? You do what your professor tells you, your teacher tells you, your boss tells you, and then you get your little food tokens every month, and everything should be fine, right? What about the people that are not that, right? Or that are actually creating culture? And if you think about how culture is created, it usually kind of starts with artists, and I'm using that very loosely as a term, right? Creators, visionaries that think about new stories, new narratives of who we could be on this planet and what we could do on this planet. Right? When you have these new narratives that then inspire entrepreneurs to go actually prototype some of this stuff, like build new solutions, build new things for the world. Right? And if that works and they scale, or if they're acquired, right, you end up in corporate world where you have sort of the intrapreneurs. You have people inside of organizations who are driving change there, who are trying to change how they do things as a business, and with that they're scaling these new ideas, right, and making them mass market. Right? And as things become mass market, you kind of have your activists, whether they're government or non-government activists, that are trying to make sure that this doesn't go out of hand, right? That they don't go too crazy with what they're doing here, and regulate things and write policies and make sure that working together somehow our cultural operating system is codified. Right? And then finally you have educators who are then imprinting the next generation, right? And telling them what it means to be a human today, what it means to be a man, a woman, a worker, whatever concept you might have there. So they all create culture by going outside of the existing culture operating system. Right? And you might have heard that whole, like, stuff happens outside your comfort zone. Well, this is way beyond comfort zone at this point, right? Because you're actually stepping outside how things are being done. Right? And many struggle with that. Right? I mean, the suicide #1 professional group for suicides is artists. Right? We're finding now a lot of more stories from Silicon Valley where it's not the cool entrepreneur doing this cool thing, but where there's actually people with depression, with suicidal tendencies, with massive abuse of substances and all kinds of things. So it's really hard to do this, right? Because you have to also, in order to stretch this, figure out how to bring something back, right? And pick up those people. Right? There's a beautiful saying that if you're too far ahead in the future, you might as well be wrong. Right? So if you're not able to make that connect again, what you're getting is constantly negative feedback. And instead of moving the culture out, right, you actually end up getting stuck there. And it's all the way to a biological level. Like if you look at this in some bacteria, right, and if a bacterial colony, if the external bacteria go out there and they say, hey, what else is out there in the world? And they come back and say, hey, we found these receptors. If the culture signals back, we don't need them, the cell actually kills itself. Well, there's actually suicide on a cellular level. Right? So think about the people who constantly hear this, no, I don't get it, that'll never work, right? You're constantly getting that feedback, and all you want to do is kind of off yourself. Right? You don't actually want to be here anymore at that point. Right? And so that's why I'm doing this, because innovation isn't easy. Right? And I see a big difference, like a lot of the big corporations I work with or see out there, they say we're doing innovation, right? And they have the cool sticky notes on the wall and they do this happy, happy dance, right? It's a lot of innovation theater, right? Because it's a cover your ass. Look, we've done innovation. We've hired the McBain consultant people and they've done the design thinking workshop and it's awesome, right? But what they're missing is that personal transformation, right? Because without personal transformation, it is just superficial bullshit, right? And innovation isn't easy. Right? And this is why I want to share with you some of the maps that, as I said, have allowed me not to kill myself yet. And I'm going to talk about this process, right, of this up and down. And before we go up and down, of course, we have to figure out who we be. Right? So who we be is about our mindset, right, that we start this journey with. Then it's about who we become, right, some of the behaviors we can adopt to make it easier to do this kind of work. And finally, how we belong, right? Because all of us have a sense that we want to belong. And especially since we've had social media, suicide, loneliness, depression, opium abuse, all of those things have gone up massively. Right? Because we're more connected than ever and lonelier than ever. Right? In Britain, they just put in a minister for loneliness because they realized it kills more people than tobacco, alcohol, and car accidents together. Right? So how do we belong? How do we feel connected to the world? So let's start with B, right, with a mindset. And mindset is about awareness and the question of who is I. Right? And we speak English well. This is not who are you, right? Because if I ask who am I, in that sense, I'm going to start telling you a bunch of stories. Where I grew up, what I've done, what I do for a living, la-di-da-di-da. Right? But when I ask who is I, then it's like, okay, but what is this? Right? What is this little human biorobot, this thing that I have going on here? Right? And so if I think about what is I wrote this very short poem, it's only 3 lines, no worries. First line is, I seem to be alive, right? And I seem to be a life. And I seem to be life. Right? It seems very simple to me. I seem to be life. We make this distinction between man and nature. I'm like, what the fuck? We are nature, right? I'm as much nature as any plant, any animal. So the four-legged friend here, we're all life, right? And if you're looking for something that unifies us, that's a pretty easy one, right? I don't have to go very far. And if you think about life, in biology, systems theory actually came out of biology because I said, what makes something alive? And I said, there's something going in, something going on, something coming out, right? And as I in this game is essentially a point of perception, right? I'm perceiving things, I'm seeing you guys, hearing things right now, right? Feeling things. I'm a point of formation, right? Something is going on here. And ultimately, I'm a point of origin, right? Something goes out, like the sound of my voice right now, for example. So everything that's alive has these components, and so do we. And this is one of my favorite symbols that reflects that. Anybody know that symbol? Medical? Yeah, close. It's actually, especially in America, it's used as a medical system a lot. This is actually caduceus, it's the staff of Hermes. And Hermes was that messenger god that went between the gods and humans and brought genius to the earth, right? He brought messages from up here, and this is his staff. The medical symbol actually is this one, it's a rod of Aesclap, and Aesclap was the medicine, was related with medicine, so it's actually only one snake, not two, right? Because it's only concerning himself with healing, not with bringing something into being, right? And this whole symbol of the double snakes, we find that all over the place. This is from Sumeria, from 3,000-4,000 years ago. We have it in South America, we have it in India, we have it around the world. We always have these two snakes, right? And what do they stand for? They stand for this, right? Our DNA, like our makeup of how we're functioning and how we're operating, right? And these two wings, they stand for delicious brains, right? And it's your left brain half and your right brain half. And then this thing up top, the pineal gland, is what this is, right? And if you take a cross-cut of your brain, pineal gland actually looks like this. You might have seen that symbol, the Eye of Horus, and you find that symbol in pines in Sumeria, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, all the way to the Catholic Church. We have a lot of pine cones at the Vatican for a reason. Right? This is where Descartes thought that the soul was actually located, was in the pineal gland. And if you look at the symbol, it's ultimately a framework. Right? It's just codified into a symbol, and it corresponds to all these other frameworks that are out there. You might have seen this one, right? Chakras. Right? Anybody know about chakras? It's the Indian version, right, where we talk about these different 7 energy centers, or seven different aspects of yourself through which you perceive and experience reality. Another version of that is this. It's a tree of life from Judaism, from Kabbalah. Right? It's also a very elaborate, awesome system. It's a little bit more complicated. It has 10 things instead of 7. And research actually shows that we have a hard time remembering more than 7. So I stick with the 7 one, it's a little easier. Right? And we find that actually, for years, I've been studying 7s and 8s. They're everywhere. Right? For example, Pythagoras, in his secret school, he taught an initiatory school where he actually taught people all that stuff before you were allowed to learn mathematics. Right? And so to learn actually about these different pieces of yourself first before he taught you the secret. Right? And you see it also in, if you want to stay Christian, in Jacob's Ladder, right, which is what the Crusaders brought back, among other things, from their learnings in the Middle East when they learned about the Nazarenes, right? Not Jesus of Nazareth, but the actual sect of the Nazarenes that had been taught concepts from the East as well. Well, you see it in Tarot, you see it in, you can relate it to astrology, and also to this one, which I really like, the I Ching, really awesome system as well. And the I Ching looks very much like my favorite metaphor, which is this one. There we go. Anybody know what this is? Old enough.
Old enough.
A punch card, yeah. That's how we used to program computers. Right? So it's a cardboard card, and essentially if there's a hole or not a hole, determines if it's 0 or 1. Right? And we stuck those things in, and there was, writing a computer program was a big box of these cards. Right? But what I like about this metaphor is that it's not a progression. It's not like, hey, once you get up here, you're enlightened. Right? Because, for example, I lived in California a long time, and there's a lot of people who are super connected to the angels and have all kinds of things going on here, and then they cut you off in traffic, and they're total assholes. Right? And it's like, how does that work? Right? I mean, that doesn't make sense. Right? But it is because they just have different holes open. Well, if you think about yourself, right, in this metaphor, you would come here and you have certain holes kind of already open with the genetics or epigenetics or whatever reason, and some propensities and likelihoods to open certain holes in certain areas. And every time you open one, you have more awareness of reality. You see more, right? And you have more experience and experience reality more directly. Right? And of course, we have to remember, especially with these very structured models, that the map is never the territory. Right? This is Alfred Count Korzybski, awesome guy, I highly recommend him, inventor of general semantics. And he said, like, make sure that you understand that however you structure reality or look at it, it's never what it is, right? And so obviously this very linear model is not what it is either, right? Because from what I know about life, it seems to more work like this, some like sort of oozing fractal thing that came out of the primordial soup and is getting ever more complex, right? All the way to us in a way, right? Because there's a lovely saying that says ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What that means is that the development of the individual mirrors the development of the entire species. When you think about yourself, at some point you were a cellotome, and 4, then 8, and 16, and so on. You grew plant-like in your mom's belly, and at some point, got cut out and cut off, and then crawled around like an amphibian, right, and learned how to walk and talk, and were imprinted with the current operating system of our society, right, and here you are, right, but it's essentially an evolution, and you went through this whole path, right, and you're still there, right, you still have all of that. So if you think about what you have, can you guys see that over there too? Oh, I want to stand your way. So if you think about who is I, right, first and foremost, I seem to have this body, right, and that's I have in common with plants, and it's governed by my brainstem. Right, my brainstem that takes care of all the, pumping blood and beating hearts and all these things that are happening there. And that's this very first part, and it's about sensing, right? The second part, if I go up, right, is emotions, and that we have in common with our friends here, right, with animals. That's that next part of moving towards pleasure or moving away from pain, right? A plant can do that. A plant can only grow towards the light, right, but animals can actually move. Right, and we do that in the limbic system without feeling. Right? The limbic system is the part that says, do I like this, do I not like this, move towards it, move away. Right? The third part is, of course, the mind. Right? And it's what makes us human, right? The whole I think, therefore I am. It's our neocortical tissue and that whole human capacity that we think we are that makes us so much supposedly better than these other creatures that are also life. Right? But I'm all that still. Right? And more, right? Once I go up here from the solar plexus, right? The sun gods, like the Ra and Apollo, right? The male linearity of rationality, I go up into the heart, right? And I'm not one of those hippie people. I was like, oh, be in the heart, man, right? Because the heart is really that part where I process I and not I, right? And I is the most profoundly painful experience that we can think of, or that I know of, right? When you're completely separate from everything else around you. Eric Fromm talked about that in The Art of Loving and figured out how can we overcome that, right? And how can we have conscious relationships where we choose what we do. Right? And then we have a voice, right? Each one of us has a unique voice and a unique individuality that we bring to the table, right? Our expression. We have a vision and the capacity to see the big picture and see something beyond ourselves. And ultimately we have this purpose thing, right? That allows us to create something here, leave a legacy, and gain insight. Right? Some of you might have heard about this concept of System 1, System 2. It's getting very popular right now. It's about the idea that most of our decisions kind of are made down here. Right? In System 1, System 2, now physical and emotional self. Like most of the day, when you think about it, you don't really consciously do things. You get up, you brush your teeth, you do things. All is happening emotionally, and you're not actually thinking about what you're doing. Right? And that second part, that System 2, is the part that actually is the rational part that says, hey, am I really going to do this? What makes sense here? What are my values? Why am I doing this? Right? So that's that more adult part that we can use a hell lot more of at the moment. Right? Because if you think about our current reflection, right, and I've been super excited since Trump got elected, actually, right, because here's this orange man. Right? It's the second chakra. Right? He's reflecting. Here's where most people are actually at. Right? So time to elevate above that and go beyond our physical self into sort of a metaphysical self, right? Because this is the part that actually is here, right? My body, my emotions, my mind, my relationships. And this part comes from seemingly from somewhere else, right? Those insights, those moments when we have inspiration that come from something bigger that we don't necessarily grasp, right? And I like to refer, this is my little biorobot, and this the Romans refer to as genius, right? We use the word usually for a person. We say Albert Einstein was a genius, or Picasso was a genius. But actually the more correct way of using the term is to say you have a genius, and every one of us has one. The genie, higher self, Christ mind, Krishna mind, Buddha mind, however you want to call that. Right? But we have that higher capacity as well. Right? And this is one of those people we call genius. I don't know, everybody know Buckminster Fuller? If you don't know him, check him out. One of the most brilliant, prolific inventors of last century. And he doesn't look very happy here right now because he was one of those people who are in the 60s realized that this doesn't work like that. Right? Our planet doesn't work this way. We need to have more sustainable solutions, better engineering, and first and foremost, we need to actually turn people on to their own capacity to create. Right? Because without that, we just have a bunch of dumb followers, and that doesn't work so well. So, what are we supposed to become? Right? What are these behaviors that he's talking about that maybe avoid our extinction on planet Earth? And this is about what to do and about responsibility. Right? If I think about back to our input process output consideration of life, input is my awareness, right? What am I taking in? And as I'm becoming aware of things, I have an invitation to respond, right? And to take responsibility. And if I do that and I do it regularly, ultimately I'm in more and more ownership of my life, right? So the first step is actually agency, to choose to take on something, because you can't fix everything that you're aware of, but you have to make choices here, right? That you choose to be responsible for. And if you do that consistently with accountability, ultimately you're in more and more ownership of your life, right? And this is where be, become, belong comes in, right? Or be is our who we are, who we show up as, right? The becoming is our willingness to transform ourselves, and belonging comes from creating value for other people. Right? The easiest way when you're stuck in shit and you want to get out of it, focus out. Right? When in doubt, focus out is one of the courses I learned, study was in the same class. Very beautiful way of saying it, right? Because when I'm stuck here, find something or something around you that you can actually help. And if you do that and create value for someone, that creates relationship. Right? And that of course never stops. It's an ongoing process, right? And it's constantly learning, constantly growing. There's no arriving here. Right? It's not about being done and being perfect and being enlightened. It's about being in this process and being aware of the fact that you are in this process. Right? And it continues to grow, and you can actually get excited about the process. So, become what? Right? And I'm going to invite you to become alchemists. Most of the time when we think about alchemy, we think about, turning lead into gold. Right? And proto-chemistry and these early attempts to make stuff. Right? But anybody want to guess what the first rule of alchemy is? I expect you don't talk about alchemy, but okay. Really, it's above so below. Right? And what it is in alchemy, the first rule of alchemy is that the alchemist needs to do with himself whatever he does to the matter. Right? So it's really actually these 7 steps, 7 again, that you see here of alchemy are about becoming, right? About self-evolution, about individuation. And the rule of don't talk about alchemy is partly also true because most of that stuff was occult and hidden, right? Because individuals are really hard to govern. Individuals ultimately self-govern, right? But if you want to govern the people, you keep them down here, right? Make them choose between left and right, between red state, blue state, and keep them tied up in dualisms so they don't actually ever evolve. Right? And so a lot of that stuff was hidden or masked in strange language, right? Like when Aleister Crowley, for example, talks about sacrificing babies, he's not talking about sacrificing babies. He's talking about using his orgasmic energy to create neuroplasticity in his brain and reprogram himself. But for the Victorian age that he lived in, telling about sacrificing babies sounded so much more fun and made people really angry. Right? So I'm going to invite you to be an alchemist and go a little bit through those stages. Right? So the first thing that alchemist does is burn stuff. Right? And as you burn stuff, you put them in a furnace. Right? What is that furnace? It's this. Right? And actually really your alimentary canal, that part that connects this to where things come out again. Right? And this little 9-meter long worm, that's sort of your OG self. That's actually your real self. All this other stuff, the skeleton and muscles and all this stuff, even like your eyes and ears and brain, was only to develop so this can get better food, be safe, and procreate. Right? But this is actually your real self, that little spaceship. Right? Because it's actually not even a thing, it's a spaceship, because there's about 1,000 species in there, about 1 trillion individuals that live in your microbiome. Right? If you go around here, even down to here, there's pieces of you that are floating around, they're coming with you at all times. Which is why it's so different when you see someone in person than when you're in a virtual team. Right? Like I always suggest to people, if you're a virtual team, have each other meet each other once. So at least that biome imprint is there. So they have bits and pieces of each other in each other. Right? And I would think that with the people here in this room, we all probably traveled enough that we probably have biomes from around the world in us right now. Right? I know when I lived in India for about 3 years, and at some point got really exposed to India, to the point where I lost about 15 pounds in a month, which I don't really have those to lose. And when you really, think back to your last time when you had a stomach infection or you had a food poisoning, you kind of want to die when that stuff's not working, right? I mean, that really brings you down to the very end of yourself if that stuff's not working. And we're just beginning now to talk about our first brain, right, about our gut and how important guts are and our microbiome is, because that actually makes decisions for you. For example, you have candida in there, and if your candida is too high, you will crave sugar. You will want to have sugar all day long, right? And which is feeding that thing. So this is actually also making decisions for you. 90% of the serotonin that we use for our brain for like feeling good comes from here, not from here. It's produced in the gut. Right? So that's the first one to take care of, is your furnace. Right? And talking about oven, in India, one of my yoga teachers talked about how there's a flame here. Right? And essentially every time you inhale, you make that flame real big because you give it oxygen, and every time you exhale, you're pushing stuff down and out. Right? And all the processing of information and emotions and stuff goes through this process. And you tilt and you do these things, not just to stretch your muscles, but to actually tilt the flame and get it all over the place. Right? That's why inversions are so good, because you're burning down the shit that usually doesn't get burned off so well. Right? And so there's an actual physical act of that. So first trick to be resilient is put good stuff in your system, right? Give it good food, move it, right? Keep this thing as flexible and strong and volatile as possible, right? And the third one is drink water. We're talking about fire, right? If you want to flush your system, one of the best things you can do is drink water, and especially here we don't do that too much, right? But I try and drink 1 liter or 2 a day, right? So actually flush this out, right? Because there's a lot of toxins that are in your system that don't get out otherwise, and you don't want to have them with you. So water then, of course, brings me to the second thing, which is dissolution, right? Once we burn something, we now take the ashes and dissolve them, right? And the dissolving really has to do with your limbic system, with your emotional side, right? That second part. Right, it's the idea of feeling good and feeling safe. Right? And there's this thing called the amygdala, which is like, imagine like little 2 ping pong balls here that are kind of either on or off. Right? And the amygdala is constantly scanning for potential danger. Right? And for example, symmetry, right? Because in nature the only things that are symmetrical is food, foe, or fuck. Right? Something to fight or run away from, something to eat, or something to copulate with. Right? The amygdala actually reacts to this, which is why it's so relaxing when you get into nature and get outside of the city for a moment. You're like, oh, why do I feel so good? It's because your amygdala is not constantly triggered by symmetry. Right? But when it gets triggered, it essentially releases 1,400 chemicals into your system that put blood into your arms and legs for fighting and running away and freezing, right? Constricts your movement, and essentially kills you. Right? And then as soon as you relax and you go, right? Breath, one of the best ways to activate your sympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic nervous system. 1,200 chemicals are released that make you feel good again. Right? So this is about psychological safety and creating yourself safe spaces. Right? Whether it's your bed or your bathtub or whatever place you can create where you can just let go. Right? And Google, for example, found that psychological safety is the #1 factor for high-performing teams. Right? If you can be yourself, if you can just be relaxed. Right? Because if you're worrying, right, the worrying comes from the German word würgen, means to choke. Right, so if you're worrying, you're actually choking yourself, which means no blood or oxygen goes to the brain, which doesn't make for good thinking. Right? So find ways to relax and find this psychological safety. And psychological safety is also a bit of the carrot and the stick of erotic romantic projections. Right? Like with Mr. Right, with Mrs. Right, then I'm going to be safe and good. Right? Or of course with this job, or with this new car. Right? And this is where a lot of marketing comes from. They're essentially saying, with this thing you'll be whole again. Right? And so we buy stuff just to feel whole for a split second before post-purchase dissonance kicks in and we want to buy the next thing. Right? And that's why it's a carrot and a stick, because we can never rely on finally meeting the right thing that makes us whole. Right? That eros is an illusion. We can have that temporarily and for moments and it's beautiful, but ultimately we're still separate. Right? And this is the next step, now that I've dissolved things, to actually separate them again and figure out what's what. Right? And if I look at what's what, I know there's I. Right? And I have this designator, my parents call me Philip, so this seems to be Philip, right? I. And everything else is not I. Right? Other things. And the word other things in Latin is actually res alles. We get the word reality from that. Right? That's what we're in relationship with. But we're not actually understanding it directly ever. Right? We understand it through these perception filters we have because of distinctions we've learned. But I was taught that this is a chair, or this is a man, or this is a woman. Right? But these are words that I learned later in other languages. People call this differently somewhere else. They call it chair, or chaise, or man, or woman, and other words. Right? And I actually can never actually experience reality. I always see it through my filters. And so the more distinctions we learn, and the clearer we are about the distinctions we're using, understanding that they have all kinds of connotations and things around it, the better. Right? And really come back to what Socrates already knew, which is we can't know anything anyway. And it's okay. Right? And especially in this country, there's a lot of insistence on experts and having the right thing and having the right answer. Right? There is no right answer. Nobody actually knows what's going on. We all tell ourselves little stories about reality, and as we're doing that, we might as well tell ourselves some good stories. And this also goes to controlling your mind, or not controlling your mind, but actually not being controlled by it. Right? On average, depending on what statistics you look at, we think about between 12 and 60,000 thoughts a day, and the majority of those is repetition and self-defeating. Right? If you think about what you thought about today, a lot of those thoughts were probably, oh, if I had said this and this would be better, or I could do this and I could. Right? There's a lot of noise. And so we do that here, with the 3 minutes at 3, taking a moment to meditate, take a moment to just be quiet and allow yourself to not think. Because thinking is awesome when you want to solve a math problem or analyze something, but most of the time you actually don't need to think. There's really no reason to think, right? And just be calm instead. And practicing that regularly, will actually help you to not drive yourself insane with the things that you think over and over. Because now that you, of course, separate things, bring things back together again. Right? And bringing back together again is about this relationship with I and other. Right? In this case, it's about actually consciously relating. Right? I talked earlier about how Eric Fromm said the worst fear of a human is if we're alone. And typically we do conformity, or we do erotic entanglement or drugs in order to feel connected. Right? When you're in the bar and you're drunk, everybody's your friend. Right? Until the next morning when you wake up and you're alone again, and there's someone in a ditch somewhere. Right? Or when your romantic partner runs away, right? Or when your job suddenly is gone, even though you did all the right things. So he said the only thing we can continuously do is actively love. Right? If we love others, there's nothing they can do to us. And so being in relationship with others is really about agreements. Right? And agreements are about saying, hey, I'm going to be there tomorrow at this time. Right? And if you do that, every time you fulfill the agreement, trust grows. Right? Think about intimacy. Intimacy is built through shared vulnerability and fulfilled agreements. Right? If I know that I can count on you because you show up when you say you will, right? There's a bond there, there's a connection there. Right? And so on the internal side, it's integrity. Right? Like especially living in a world that constantly changes, the only thing that I know how to rely on sometimes, most of the time, is kind of my own integrity and the agreements that I make with people. That I live up for that. Right? It gives me some sort of foundation. Because otherwise I have little to stand on. Right? And to the outside, that's accountability. And it's really about commitment, right? And doing whatever the fuck it takes to make something happen. Right? Because, we all are wishy-washy committed to things along the spectrum, right? We have lots of things where, I should write a book, or I should do this thing, or I should do that. And it never actually happens, right? And every time you break an agreement with yourself, you're also enforcing the idea that you can't trust yourself. And that you actually, should go down that road of going to off yourself because you're unworthy anyway. Right? So be really clear about the agreements you make with yourself and with others, because that's ultimately where your identity comes from, like the things that you're really committed to, and also where your belonging comes from. Right? Coming back to creating value for others that they can count on you for, right? That builds relationship. Right? And of course, it would be nice if everything just was so nice and structured and orderly. There's fermentation, and shit starts to mold, and shit starts to go wrong. Right? This is Shiva, the creator god, and also the destroyer god. Right? Because if you're creating something new, in the process of it, you're also destroying, right? And sometimes you actually create shit. Right? If you actually go out there and you risk things and you go put yourself out there, some of the things are not cool, right? And there's failure. Right? And this whole Silicon Valley fail fast thing, personally, I don't believe in that. I believe in experiments and science. Right? I'm testing something and I'm learning something. Right? Because then failure is not always just death. Right? If I associate failure with ego death, right, which it is, right? I had a projection and a vision of something, and then it didn't come true. So all the ideas that I had of the future are now gone. Right? I had that first experience really massively when my ex-wife left me. And I had all this vision of the future and how I was going to have this life and kids, we even had names picked out, everything. And then she went away from one day to the next. And everything that I had imagined about my life was not real anymore, right? Or jobs, similar thing, when your job goes away, right? Or when other things happen, or when your startup fails, right? You had all this wonderful idea for the startup and you thought it was the greatest shit ever, and then nobody buys your product, right? How do you overcome that, right? And this is really by knowing that that happens, right? Just to know that creation also means shit. That also happens. And the good news is, lotus flowers, right, the sign of enlightenment, lotus flowers actually grow in shit really well, right? And nothing is really what it seems like, and everything is always evolving, right? And keeping that in mind. So that then brings us to this second to last stage of purifying yourself, right? That you know it's ongoing, it's a constant process. And does anybody here know the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull? A couple of people, awesome. Right? Beautiful, beautiful story, highly recommended. It's about the seagull who was away from the tribe and did his own thing and had all kinds of crazy flying action he was trying out, and all the others were looking at him saying, yeah, you're crazy, right? But eventually he figured it out and did these beautiful formations and beautiful stuff, and that was awesome, but not until he taught others, right? And once he shared that with others and showed them that they also could do this, that's when he kind of reached seagull enlightenment, right? And so really, one thing to survive is to look at something bigger than yourself, right? In AA, for example, Anonymous Alcoholics, the first thing that they teach you is you can't do this by yourself, right? You need to surrender to something bigger than yourself. And it makes sense, because if I have nothing bigger than myself, why would I have a reason to grow, right? Otherwise, if I'm trying to maintain who I am, I'm ultimately eroding myself. I'm not evolving. And so if I want to grow, if I want to make this journey acceptable and survive it, orient yourself in something bigger than yourself, right? Because then you go to this last stage when everything comes back together and you remind yourself that you are actually a magician, right? Every one of us is a little quantum machine, and in every moment we're collapsing probability into actuality. With everything we do, with every choice we make, with every movement, with every emotion, with every thought, we are affecting reality, right? All of what you're experiencing right now is your choice. Every single choice you've made, right? That brought you into this room right now, right? Even the choice that you made in this beautiful weather to come listen to me talk about these things. Thank you for that, right? But this is where we really are, right? We are magicians. And taking that place of sort of above us, angels and demons and God at some point, below us, elementals, and really understanding that it is our job to show up here and co-create. It's not just a nice thing to do when you're thinking about why your job is boring, right? Every one of us is called to be creator of this reality. And magicians do rituals. You might have heard about morning and evening rituals. There are a lot of really wonderful things out there that talk about how important they are. So one thing I found, actually, the easiest way to make sure that I stay grounded in my work is to actually boot up and boot down my little bio-robot every day. Right? And so the first thing I do in the morning is actually, empty, evacuate, right? The bio-robot, drink some water, right? Get it pliable, get out of the toxin from the night before, do some movement, right? Whatever it is, doesn't have to be a lot. You don't have to exercise an hour every day. It actually doesn't help. 20, 30 minutes a couple times a week is actually much better for you. Right? But do something, stretch, right? Every animal, when he gets up from sleeping, first thing he's going to do is this, right? Stretch. Get rid of that fascia that's collected in your body overnight. Right? So do something for your body, do something for your emotions, right? Think about something that you're grateful for. Easiest way to actually bring your heart rhythm into coherence is to think something that you're grateful for, right? And to actually have your emotional level setting for the day, so that by the time your boss's email comes in and all this bullshit and traffic and la-di-da, you at least remember that at some point you felt good today, right? Do something for your mind, right? Train that and learn how to not think for a moment, right? So that you have that baseline as well. Think about your different relationships, right? Like who is in your world and who do you have commitments with? Like who matters, right? Who do you need to do something for today? Do something for your voice, some creative expression, whatever it might be that works for your voice, right? Dance, sing, paint, doodle, right? Do something. Remind yourself of your vision and remind yourself that you're a creator. Right? And it can take 2 minutes, it can take 2 hours, depending on the day. But boot up, boot down in the evening, the other way around, and really come back to yourself. Right? So, really quick, one last thing, belong. Right? And I've talked about V7 a lot. So one really, really super simple system for creation, right, or how pretty much everything seems to come into being, is this. Right? And you start, just open them up. start here, right? Something comes in, some signal. You're like, huh, I see a trend, you see something that moves you, and then you go, huh, I could see this, right? I could actually have a vision for this, right? And you envision it, and then you begin to talk about it, right? And you test the feasibility by talking about it. You tell people about it, you interview people about it, you find out about stuff, and then when you're committed, right? Once you're actually committed, at that point, you can make it real, right? And then you need to find out, what do I need to learn, what do I need to know, right? Am I sexy enough to attract the resources I need? And can I ultimately bring it all the way to the ground, give birth to it, if you want to use a gender bias metaphor here. And that's kind of it in terms of be, become, belong, right? Our mindset, the behaviors we engage in to continue to grow and have that resilience to do that and ultimately create something. So, before we go into the practical part, any questions? You know, there was a lot, and I kind of gave you a fire hose of hopefully not too much mansplaining the universe, but any questions before we go into actually experiencing some of these things?
Yes.
Yeah. So, good. Right. Sure. Here. Like that, because I guess I'm recording for the video. There you go. Now you're a rock star. Oh, here. Now you're a rock star.
I have a question. You have this from body to emotion to heart and voice, and from then, did you say something what we can do about the upper parts?
Yes, in a way, in terms of what you can do for yourself. I mean, yeah. So, experience your voice. Right, do something that you can do for your voice. This part was the part about seeing a bigger vision. Right, like if you think about here is where a lot of people are coming into right now. A bit of hedonistic self-expression, right? It's like me as an artist, my thing, right? I'm discovering my voice, right? But that's sort of the beginning of self-actualization, what Maslow talked about. But it doesn't actually mean anything until you put it in service to something bigger than yourself, right? And see that bigger picture and actually spend time thinking about what can you see for the world? What's the biggest thing you can see for yourself? Right? Intrinsic motivation actually comes from having a clear vision of yourself in the future. And so spending time with vision and spending time in some sort of ritual with yourself around reminding yourself of your magic.
What do you do if important people in your life don't understand? And not only don't understand, but aggressively trying to enforce their version on you, or that you're wrong and that you should be following a certain route?
Good question. The thing is with transformation, if you're going into a transformation and you're in relationship, whether it's your family, your partner, your friends, you know, your co-workers, every one of us, we want to be safe too. We want to expect you to be a certain person, right? I know you are that person. You don't do that stuff, right? And so we all actually kind of hold each other hostage in our expectations of each other, right? So when you're going for a transformational process, one thing is to actually let people know that that's happening with you and say, hey, I'm going through growth right now. I'm going through some stages. I might be a little different. I'm still figuring this out myself. Right? That's one thing. The other is if they are indeed not available to you. You know, I talked about flushing earlier, right? From water to emotions to thoughts. It also goes for relationships, right? Especially if you're on that path of growth. Sometimes people don't come along with you, right? And that doesn't mean that you can judge them or you have to judge them, or you can just accept the fact that right now they're not necessarily there with you. That can also change again. But I've had friends who, you know, in 1 year told me I was completely wacko for doing the things I was doing, and 5 years later came back to me and said, this thing that we were doing back then, there was something about that. Can you tell me about that? You know, because then they were ready. You know what I mean? And everybody goes their own path. Everybody has their own trajectory, evolution. Right? We can only ever teach people how to communicate with us and how to relate with us. Right? I can't change anybody else. I can't make everybody help me or support me or be with me or any of that stuff. I can only offer what I have and see if the agreements make sense. Right? And this is also the difference between a bit of the difference of romance and partnership, right? Where it's not always awesome, right? But you actually have to have some foundational agreements with each other around what makes you want to be together. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess with the friends and romantic partners, there is like a society accepts that those things often don't work out. But in regards to, for instance, family, there is no acceptance in society that those things don't work out.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a little bit.
And you know, that's the thing about having your power in that relationship. The key is that they don't drain you. Right? Like some people actually have shitty families. Sorry to say. Right? There's some really challenged people out there in terms of their family relationships. Now you can either be a victim to that, right, and go into the same dynamics with them again and again, or you can even say, hey man, you're my family, by default I love you, and it would be really great if we wouldn't talk for a while. And that's absolutely okay too, right? Or to choose how you're engaging with them, right? Because you don't have to invite a dysfunctional relationship over and over again because you're only going to drain your energy.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have something else.
Sure.
I am from Extinction Rebellion, and I'm an artist and also yes, an activist. And since I found this possibility to create in this way with other people, there are so many who have these ideas and really do something. And I have these ideas all the time, and some I realize also. And but I get burned out really, really fast. So because I have so many ideas, like me, and also activate people into this direction. It's so much that I feel like I can't handle this burning flame. And maybe you have.
Well, I mean, being idea people is of course awesome, right? And the problem with a visionary is when you think about even like that left and right brain half we talked about earlier, right? In that idea space and the right brain half, on this side, right brain half, there's no time, right? So here, all this shit happens all at the same time, all together, right? And it doesn't come into linearity until you take it over here and then bring it into this reality. Right? And so a lot of my artist friends and visionary friends suffer from that because they can see all of it right now. And every day is a new idea, or every day is a new thing, and you're like, oh, what do I focus on? Right? And this is where habits come in, right? And the idea of actually having some sort of ritual, like for example, for me, with writing, the only way I'm actually writing is if I make sure that I write for 5 minutes every day. Right? Even if it's crap, even if it's, I don't know what to write right now, this is fucking suck, why do I do this to myself? Even if it's bad, to actually just get into the habit of doing it, right? And have some sort of regular routine, because otherwise, and think about your own portfolio, right? To say, here's an idea, what does it look like when it's done, and how can I take it through that process, right? And actually track as you go, and might not feel like working on this one day, then you can work on this a little bit more, but figure out nearly like a little scoreboard, like use Kanban boards, right? But like a board that actually moves from point A to point B, and you see your projects too, you see where this is at. Right? And so when you say, hey, I want to work on something, you can look at your work, but I'm a very visual person too. I need to see it in front of me. But I can see it, oh, this is here, this is here. Right now I feel more like this kind of activity, I'm going to move this forward a bit. Right? But you keep track of it, and that's coming back to systems and things like that help a lot.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you so much for being here today. If you guys want the slides, I'm always happy to share those. And, one thing is, remember, the future is in your hands, right? And you're really the heroes of this story. And if you want to connect with me, feel free to email me. I'm happy to send you the slides. Or also, if something sinks in today, in the next couple of days, if you have questions, feel free to contact me. I live for this shit, and I could geek out on that for hours. So if you have questions or suggestions or ideas or any of those things, please, feel free to do that. And other than that, really thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it.